Welcome to the Outriders Chatterpoint Podcast, your source for the latest news and information about Star Wars Shatterpoint, with your hosts Matt, Dan, John, and Jeff. And now, the Outriders. This is the way.
Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Outriders Chatterpoint Podcast. Did you guys hear little fanfares in the background?
I'm doing the happy dance right here. No.
Yeah. I am Outrider Matt, and today we have with us
Outrider Dan
and Outrider John.
Okay, well, good to have you guys back in. Well, we're not in the studio. We're actually doing the remote thing now because somebody decided to move away from our normal studio setup. But we're very excited to bring the first episode of Star Wars Chatterpoint. This is going to be a sister podcast. Some of you may know us from the Star Wars Legion Outriders podcast. We've done, 3 episodes over there?
Yep, a whole bunch of episodes.
Yeah, so we've been covering Legion since the inception, and we're going to be doing the same for Shatterpoint. We're going to be having a group of hosts that come on, so it's not just going to be me, John, and Dan. I'm sure we're going to get Outsider Dan in there too as well. And the return of, my name is Jeff. So Outrider Jeff. Yeah.
Yes, FA is returning.
Yeah, very excited for that. So we got a big crew that's going to be covering this really big game. But we are so excited to have for our very first episode an interview with Will Shick, one of the main designers. He's been out doing the press tour, and we were lucky enough to get an interview with him today to talk about Shatterpoint, some of the design philosophy that went into the game, its mechanics, and buckle up because it's a hell of a ride. But real quick, Dan, can you tell us a little bit about yourself for those that may not know?
So for the those of you who don't know us from the Legion side of our podcast, I'm Outrider Dan. we're all based out of Las Vegas. Well, except for Matt, of course, you decided to leave us.
I messed that statement right up.
Yep, you did. But yes, my wargaming career actually started with Legion. So the only miniatures game I did prior to that was X-Wing. And then I did leave X-Wing for a little bit to play a little Star Wars Destiny, little dice and card action. I remember that.
I found my boxes of that when I was unpacking the other day, and I got a little sad. I don't want to throw them away, but I don't know what to do with them. So if there's any Destiny communities out there that would like an influx of supplies, you reach out to us, okay?
Oh, yes, definitely, because I still got all my stuff in storage, too.
All right, John, how about yourself, buddy? Mr. Gaming ADHD.
Right,
okay.
Yeah. So I have been doing more of the hobby side than the gaming side for most of my life, but I've done everything from all the GW fare, and more recently been way more into the AMG products. You know, Matt and I and Dan were championing Legion 5 years ago, and played a lot of that. Got into MCP when that came out. Really enjoying the skirmish gaming. So while I still dabble from time to time with Legion, when Shatterpoint was announced, that really got me hooked. The look of the models, I'm so excited to paint them. In the
Seems like you're going to have a lot of character to really put some detail on there.
Yeah, exactly. It's such a cool, unique art style. I'm putting together an Endor themed table right now. Anybody who has listened to me on the Legion podcast knows how much I love Wookiees. So I'm hoping that we'll see some Wookiees announced sooner than later in Shatterpoint.
Wookiees, Ewoks, Tawns, anything with fur, really.
Yeah.
I think it's... but yes, and speaking to Shatterpoint, I can give everyone the moment that I knew I was buying this game. And that was, of course, with the Adepticon rules. Because prior to this, I'm like, okay, I mean, I've got so much invested in Legion, I may dabble. But they showed some things coming up at the Adepticon, and when a slide came up with a certain Iden Versio on it, those of you that know me from Legion know that Iden Versio is my boo. I am the Legion's greatest Iden Versio fan, so that was the moment my wallet said, "Oh no, not this again."
Wow. I'm so glad that you're so invested in her redemption arc and coming over to the rebels. And being,
about that,
heart of the rebellion. So, thank you, Dan.
I'm I'll put it this way: I'm the novel Iden Versio fan, the prequel before Battlefront 2 game.
All right. Sure. Whatever you got to tell yourself, buddy. But I myself have been playing tabletop games. I started in 40K years ago, and I think I've played just about everything except Bolt Action, which I'm sure I'll probably play that at some point too. But
that just gave all my stuff away already.
Yeah. I that's why it came to mind, because I know you were giving it away. But it's Legion's been a big love of mine, and Shatterpoint looks like it's going to be right in there too. So not replacing, but what is it like, Dan? Perhaps it rhymes.
It's like poetry. It rhymes.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. That's right. But
I thought you were going to go the force dyad angle for a minute there, but
no, that's dumb. I kid. But one of the things, we are definitely the more relaxed of the podcasts that I'm sure you'll find. We try to keep it light, beer and pretzels. We do love to just geek out on Star Wars, and I do hope that comes across. But anyways, we're going to take a short break, and we're going to be right back with our interview with Will Shick. Stay tuned.
Ending the transmission now would be most unfortunate. And now, the Outriders.
Hello there, Outriders, and welcome to, another thing that is going to be the very first thing happening for the first episode of the Chatterpoint Chatterpoint Podcast. We have an interview today with Mr. Will Shick. Hey, I can edit that. Now I probably won't, because
we're keeping that
I talked about it. So, okay, That's fine. We're just going to roll with it. But Matt, Dan, and John back with you. And as I said, Mr. Shick is joining us. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great. It's a super rainy day in the Pacific Northwest. So, standard,
when you live in
standard
Seattle,
stuff.
you get used to it, right?
You do. I mean, you have to, right? There's no way around it. It's going to rain a lot on you, and that's fine.
Right on. Well, we have a bunch of questions that we're going to be asking about Shatterpoint. That is, it's coming our way sooner rather than later. And I know a lot of the stuff you've already addressed in other videos, but just to kind of lay it out for the people that may not know, before we get into that, there was quite an event that happened here recently that you were a part of. What was Star Wars Celebration like? Oh my gosh.
It was Star Wars-horrific, I think is the appropriate term.
Was that Star Wars horrific or
no. Okay. Horrific. Very different. It was a wild time. This was my second celebration that I've been to. I briefly got to see the one in Anaheim last year, because that was the first one that we did as AMG post the COVID times. And so that was really neat, but it was fun to be there all 4 days of the show. And especially really interesting to be on the other side of the pond and kind of get to interact with the European community and players and all of those folks that we don't normally get to see at a lot of shows. You see several of the players will make the trek over for like Worlds and stuff like that. Especially at Adepticon and those things, but to just get to be somewhere else and to kind of get to interact with a lot of people that don't normally make the trip because they don't play competitively or whatever. They were there with their kids or their families. It was really fun. It was really neat. And then of course, to be surrounded, just immersed in Star Wars fandom is always a crazy thing. One of my favorite games to play is I like to keep track of the different cosplays that I see. I think one of the most fascinating takeaways that I had this year was the amount of Mandalorians is quickly like equaling or slightly outnumbering the number of like Imperial troopers. And so that's kind of a really, I don't know, it's an interesting takeaway. Obviously the Mandalorian, super popular, it makes total sense. So it was fun. People do crazy stuff there. There was a full size probe droid that was driving around, and the guy was just like piloting it everywhere, and it'd beep and boop down the aisle, and everyone would have to like clear the way because this thing was massive.
Was it like IG-12 style? Was he just kind of nestled in there?
Yeah,
Spoilers, Matt. Spoilers.
What? That's not a spoiler.
Yeah, he built the whole droid, and then basically it had kind of like a giant Roomba base, and so that's how he'd drive it around, and then the droid would do things. I've learned now that apparently one of the big things that folks do is they'll get really good at driving their droid, so their astromech or their probe droid in this case. And the real skills, the people who take it very seriously are the ones who can do it behind their backs, so you don't know who in the crowd is controlling it. And this is apparently like a big thing. So so I learned that. So that was pretty neat. But yeah, it's just a crazy time, and to see the amount of like just people who pour their passion into different things, whether it's building an astromech or making a fantastic costume from a character that they really like, or of a subset of like races that they love. The amount of effort that goes into like the different like groups, because their entire like societies, there's not just the 501st. There are so many other cosplay like groups that just do their thing, and they get together, and and Star Wars Celebration is really cool. They set up kind of this galactic tour where effectively every like major cosplay group can sign up, and they get a little space, and they decorate the space. And so there was like a bounty hunter jail that one of them set up. There was a Mandalorian throne that somebody set up. There was a cantina that was set up. It was wild. And that was easily the most difficult place to get into. It was packed with people all the time. But so it's incredible. It just kind of reminds you of the fact that, hey, you get to be a part of, making an impact on this galaxy and this massive amount of people who just have fallen in love with the worlds and the characters and stuff. So it's really refreshing. And then of course to have the crazy honor, the surprise that we did to get to go up on the main stage, because we knew when we went we were going to get a panel, but I think it was a couple days before they contacted us, and they're like, hey, do you want to come up on the main stage and do a quick presentation like a lot of the other the toy folks do, especially Lego and Hasbro all get up there. Like, we would love to have Shatterpoint up there. And I was like, that's amazing, I can't wait. And then normally I'm pretty good in front of crowds, but the fact of the matter was I had no idea what we were going to do up there. And so it was one of the more nerve-wracking things, because I'm like, I'm gonna go in front of a lot of people and I have no clue like what they want. Like, what am I going to talk about? What are we doing? We didn't know if there'd be a table to put the miniatures on. Like, we went in completely blind. Mm-hmm. Got backstage, everyone was great. They were like, hey, there's a table, you put that stuff there. I'm like, awesome, I brought these things, we'll put them out. I hope your camera can get close. That was foolish, because the cameras could go up my nose if they wanted to. They're so like, I don't know what I was thinking. And so we got to go on stage and kind of just explain in a very brief amount of time miniatures games and what AMG gets to do, and some other some not traditional mass market ways to experience the Star Wars galaxy. And that was really awesome. It was really fun. The people there were great. They have hype men who like run around and get the crowd like going and all that stuff. So it's very weird. It's just a surreal experience for a guy who's just like, I just wanted to make some games. But so that was really awesome. And it's just, it's another mark of why working with LFL is so phenomenal, because we have so many advocates within that organization and people who really get what we do, and they really do. They give a damn, and that's really neat to know that you have people who are like, they're throwing ideas at you sometimes. They're like, what if you did this for the games? I'm like, that sounds cool. We could figure that out. And sometimes they throw an idea at you, and you're like, this would be phenomenal. Like we talked a little bit about it at Adepticon, but the fact that we were able to get some inside info on the Inquisitors from the Obi-Wan show, and kind of get some first look at that stuff and work with them to get ahead on that compared to what our normal schedule would be. That was a very neat opportunity, and one that they presented to us as a possibility. And it goes back to the fact that relationship is very rewarding. And, Star Wars Celebration is kind of a moment where they get to do a lot of really cool stuff and promote Star Wars in general, but they also do a lot of really pro licensee moves, like bringing people up, letting them show off their new stuff, giving the chance for people to do panels in front of folks. And then of course, you just have an excuse to go for 4 days in London and wander around the Star Wars Hall and see all the cool things. So that's not too bad either. But I think it was really, not only was it neat to be there for the demos for Shatterpoint, but we had demos running for Legion as well. and the amount of Legion core sets that we were able to like hand out to people and sell throughout the weekend,
Nice.
from folks who took a demo and I think they walked away with like three of the Clone Wars core set out of all the ones they brought by the end of the weekend. So that was phenomenal because you see the fact that there's so many people out there who they just need to be exposed to the hobby, and it kind of lights them up, and they see the potential and they get really excited about it. And those are the moments that you really live for when you're doing this stuff, is just knowing that 13-year-old kid who spent all of his con money on the Clone Wars core set might be the 40-year-old me, maybe getting to make some games or do a podcast like you guys do or whatever, right? Like you realize that investment is more than just the game or the miniatures. It's a community, and it's like a lifelong investment in terms of like things that will bring you excitement and joy, and you can explore it in a lot of different ways. So that's always like the really like gross, warm, fuzzy heart feels that you get when you're at those shows.
Man.
Well, right now you're kind of almost like on a promotional tour, it seems like, because going from Adepticon to it's like when an actor launches a new movie coming out. It's like you're kind of doing all this stuff to promote. Are you seeing a lot of excitement growing for this?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we announced, we saw some good buzz, and then everyone was like, "Tell us more," and I was like, "Well, no." And then people were like, "But that's not fair." I sent that email. Yes. Yeah, exactly. And so it's been interesting. It's definitely weird how everything lined up. Like normally Star Wars Celebration, Adepticon, all these shows don't typically go back to back to back. So it's a bit fortuitous, and then at the same time, it is very exhausting because you go to Chicago, then you pop back, do some laundry for a day, and then you're off to the UK to do stuff. And of course, we were visiting with all of our great Asmodee partners out there. So Simone Elliott and Liz Piotr are still out there. They just flew back today. So they were out of the office for almost a month straight, and it does feel a little weird. Like, what is this jet setting life that I totally didn't sign up for? I knew I was gone for a long time because my wife told me the day before I came back, my 13-year-old son actually asked her, she was like, "Dad's been gone a long time, hasn't he?" And I was like, "Oh, we got there."
Wow, I noticed.
Only took 3 weeks for the teenager to be like, "You know what? One of my parents has been missing for a while." I was like, perfect teenage response right there.
Wow. So racking up all those frequent flyer miles, how bad was the jet lag going to Celebration?
So I find that going to and gaining the hours, it's not as bad. Coming back is rough because effectively I was awake for 23 hours on my travel day back because I had to wake up and then I had to get to the airport. And one of the things that I learned, because I'd been to the UK before, but I'd never been in downtown London before. Mm. And one of the things that I realized is that I'm not a very anxious person, but if you put me in the back seat of an Uber in downtown London traffic, I need anxiety meds. Like, it was too much. Not only you're on the wrong side of the road, the way that they have determined how they will drive and how pedestrians will just jump out in front of cars and trust that they'll stop like mid drive is incredible to me. I was convinced every time we got in a car, I was convinced that was the moment I was going to see somebody get run over and I was going to have to deal with it. Like, it was nonsense. But so anyway, so it's a long, like, I think we had to go 15 miles. It took 2 hours to get through all of like downtown London and the traffic and everything. It was nuts. And then you have the flight back, which is 9 hours. You lose 8. So your 9-hour flight becomes a 2-hour flight technically. And then you're like, okay, well, it's like 9 p.m. for me, but it's 2 p.m. my time now. So I guess I'm staying up for another 8 hours so that I don't go to bed and then have my clock completely ruined. So that's the hardest part, is just making sure that you readjust as quickly as possible. And then those next couple of days, you're kind of cranky. But it wasn't too bad. I wouldn't want to do it a lot. I don't know how people can do it 2 weeks out of a month, but it was all right.
So the next con is what, Gen Con in August? So you got a little bit of time to rest.
Yeah. So there is UK Games Expo. That will be a big one that I don't believe that I'm going to, but you never know until the last minute. But UK Games Expo will be big, not only because it's kind of one of Europe's bigger tabletop gaming shows, but also because it happens on the week that Shatterpoint releases. So June 2nd, So they'll kind of they'll be the show that the game premieres and launches at. So everyone was very excited over there to get to kind of be at the front of that. And that was really neat. And then after UK Games Expo, it will be Gen Con. And then I don't know if there's anything else. There's Essen, but Asmodee usually does that. So we don't usually do a lot for Essen. So there's a couple more for the rest of the year. But as far as like most of the staff, and I think myself are concerned, we might wind up at Gen Con to do some stuff. We might not. Because Asmodee does manage most of the show stuff, like the booth and the exhibit hall and stuff at that. And then really Adepticon's kind of the one that's squarely in our sites, because that's where we do all the things.
Right. Wow. Yeah, that's a very busy schedule. And now you just get to sit back and relax and just, let the game, get out into the wild. No stress there.
No, we just threw up the rule book and we were like, this will be perfect. No one will have any questions. There's no reason to look at social media at all.
Well, actually, we happen to have some questions right here. But
oh, well, darn, I guess I was wrong on that one.
So, of course, we've been excited since the announcement. A lot of people have been since the first preview started coming out. For the people that are listening in the audience may not have gotten a chance to see much of it yet. For those guys, can you give us kind of like the elevator pitch? What is Shatterpoint going to be all about? What can they look forward to?
Sure. So Star Wars Shatterpoint is effectively the character-driven skirmish game in the Star Wars galaxy. So if you imagine that you want an experience that kind of replicates the animated series like Star Wars Clone Wars or Star Wars Rebels, that's the basic thrust of Shatterpoint. It's fast, furious, kind of chaotic battles between big name characters and their little cohorts. There's a lot of dynamic movement. It really leans into focusing on the duels and the interpersonal like actions in combat. And at the end of the day, when you defeat your opponent's characters, you know that they'll just be back next episode. So it leans more into the adventure and kind of childlike wonder of Star Wars, as opposed to like a Legion, which it takes a bunch more realistic and like movie centric approach where you can feel the weight of every action and you kind of sense that there's a galactic conflict going on, and it means more to just kind of what the stakes are. And that's not to say that Shatterpoint doesn't have stakes, but the stakes just feel very different, right? It's like, oh, if I don't win this one, I can always come back next week and try again.
You can feel that from, I played a demo game with some of the rules that were leaked already, and you can feel that in the pace of the game. You can see it in the art style of it. It does a great job of differentiating itself from Legion. I really love that.
John, just to correct you real quick, it's not leaked, it's previewed.
Sorry, previewed. Well, no, I mean, it
is out. There's no leaks.
Well, yeah,
no more leaks. Yeah. It was all on purpose. No, and I think that's one of the things we've talked about a lot is just a lot of people are like, well, why didn't you make the miniatures the same? Because then you have cross promotion, and why didn't you do X, Y, or Z? Why aren't the games more compatible? And I think they could have been, but one of the big things about, and we talked about this at the Star Wars panel that wasn't on stage, it was our dedicated Star Wars panel, is, Star Wars has multiple different experiences baked into it. And one of the experiences that we wanted to provide was a very character-driven, focused kind of game that let us really zoom in on the micro scale of what these characters do, and to ignore the larger battles and the larger conflicts, and instead say, okay, let's tell some personal stories. Let's get into that moment where, we've moved away from the big starfighter battle over Coruscant. Obi-Wan and Anakin have crashed into, the Separatist Alliance ship, and now they're working their way through the different corridors and halls to try to go save Chancellor Palpatine, and they run into Dooku, and now we get a very personal dual story between them. And to do that effectively, like one of the things that I really believe when it comes to just design in general, not just game design, but the overall design of the entire product, is players should ideally be able to identify what experience they're getting into before they even play the game, right? So you want the visuals to tell a lot of the story and the miniatures are a really key part of that. And so when you talk about, character focused, like action adventure, high octane excitement, you want a very different visual style than you do for a Legion, which is more of that, again, that really locked in kind of real world, more grit and grime feel to it. And So you go, okay, well, let's make the characters like these are heroes. So how does a child see a hero, right? Like how does a young like mind view heroes? Well, you view them as larger than life. So they have these exaggerated proportions. They're bigger. They're just everything is blown up about them. They're larger than the mind really can take in. And so you use those visual cues. Obviously the art style is very different. It harkens back to an 80s and 90s animated feel, which was really fun to work with Lucasfilm. But all of that stuff ties in. And then you see, the gantries and the levels and the table set up. That beautiful table that Michael Archer did for our demos at Adepticon, and then went off to Star Wars Celebration. Like you look at that and you can see the scene straight from the animated show, right? And it looks different than the really tactical and strategic placement of a Legion table, which is much bigger, and it has, corridors and alleyways, and it has line of sight blocking pieces, and you can see how the tactical push pull of the units moving and trying to capture important zones is. Star Wars Shatterpoint, when a table's set up in kind of the theme, right? It's like it's all high rises and gantries, and you're just like, oh, they're going to flip over these, they're going to jump over those, they're going to run over those, they're going to knock each other off of that. You immediately can feel a bit of like what to expect from the experience. And then ideally when you sit down at the table and you look at the rules, then the rules design and the character design and all that stuff feeds into what you expect, right? Expectations should be met. And so that's, it's definitely like a lot of the visual design cues and stuff were made with that in mind. We always knew that we wanted to create an experience that really focused on characters, but focused on characters in that animated series kind of like way. I always kind of explain it as like, if you imagine that the Clone Wars animated series was shown to children in the Galactic Republic, it's like the propaganda cartoon, right? It even has the propaganda guy voice at the start. He gives you like the big overbeats, and then you go in and you always know the heroes are going to come out on top. And for the most part, the heroes are always heroic and the villains are always villainous. And again, we wanted that kind of simplicity, that black and white kind of feel to it. And so like everything from the ground up was really built that way.
So when you guys first came up with the idea for this game, I mean, the first game that AMG really put out there was MCP, or Marvel Crisis Protocol. And, the three of us were playing Legion for a few years before that came out. And when Shatterpoint was announced, we kind of were thinking about, okay, how is this going to play? How is this going to interact between what we already have in Legion, what we saw in MCP? And you guys came up with a completely new rule set that was a little bit of each with a little bit of other things, and it really just feels unique. When you came up with that game system, was it something that was did you come up with a system and say, hey, let's add Star Wars to this, or was it always a Star Wars product?
So I think it's a little chicken or egg, right? Like one of the things that you always wind up doing when it comes to just game design in general, right, is whenever you play a game, you find things that you like. It's kind of, I always go back to two analogies. There's gardening and there's cooking. This is going to be the cooking analogy, right? You go to a restaurant, you sit down, and you eat a meal, and you're like, oh, I really liked this part. I didn't like this part. I think I could do this at home better. If you're into cooking, then what you want to do is you want to take things, you want to innovate. There's a reason why, if you give the same chefs, like 3 different chefs, the same exact ingredients, you're going to come up with 3 different meals. If you instead tell those 3 chefs, hey, take these ingredients and make a hamburger out of them, you're going to get 3 different hamburgers. Like they're all basically burgers, but each one's going to appeal to a different person because of different reasons, right? They're going to season it different. They're going to put different toppings on it. One's going to make an aioli, which is just a fancy version of mayonnaise with some like crap in it. And one of them's going to make like a balsamic reduction, all this nonsense, right? And one of them's just going to slap ketchup on it. And so I think like one of the really exciting parts about getting to do what we do, and especially to look at game design and kind of focus on that stuff, one of the things that's always fascinated me is I like to play a lot of games. And then what you do is you get those ingredients. You say, okay, I liked this, I liked that. How could I put these together in a way that appeals to me more, or that I can see, you can kind of start to see the connections between these different things. And then how do you pull this together? And those things are always in the back of your mind. But most of the time they're just kind of like, they just kind of float. They're just free electrons that just kind of like bounce around. And eventually you get an opportunity where somebody's like, hey, we want you to create a new game. We have the Star Wars IP. we would love it if you did something like you did with Marvel for Star Wars, because we feel like you did a really good job with it. And at that point, it's like it's free reign. So all of a sudden you're like, okay, well, what would I want out of a Star Wars game? How would I take some of the ideas that have been bouncing around for a while that we've talked about, maybe things that didn't work out, right? There's a number of times where you have thoughts, or you try things in a game and you're like, well, it just doesn't work for this game. You know, this seasoning doesn't fit the dish, but in a different dish, it would be amazing. And so ultimately, like the final design of the rules for Shatterpoint was based in how do you make a great Star Wars game. But a lot of the things that wound up in it were ideas that I had either wanted to try, or were discussions that I had had with Pagani or other people throughout my career in the industry about, well, could you do this? Could you take this idea and go here and that? And how would those things work, right? So it's like I said, it's a bit of both. There's kind of this moment where you get that center nucleus that you need, and then all the electrons kind of like start zipping to it, and they create, you know, the perfect little balance for the atom that you want. And there's my atomic mass tie-in. Bam, I did it.
Hey, wow.
Hey.
I didn't see that coming.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things you mentioned is characters are going to be kind of front and center for this. Small interactions, small groups. You're going to have some flexibility building strike teams, though, and you can include a lot of different characters that have already been announced in those lists. Can you tell us about some of the rules for team building that helps kind of shape your roster for the characters you get to field?
Yeah. So for the most part, one of the really fun things about doing character-driven experiences like Shatterpoint, and you see this with, you know, the Marvel Crisis Protocol game that we made as well, is that the rules aren't necessarily as strict in terms of how you as a game developer and designer have to be with different factions, right? Or how characters can interplay with each other or join different teams. And I think that's really awesome, because from a sense of, we're going to make a game that is focused on the characters, right? We all have our favorite characters, and those characters don't typically always work together in the media. They might be on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of their good or versus evil alignment. They might be from entirely different time periods. And if you can give players the opportunity to be creative and to tell their own stories within the sandbox of the IP in a way that doesn't necessarily break the game balance or design, and that stays somewhat true to things that could have happened in the canon, or provides a canonical experience, right? If you want to play strictly by the numbers, you can, and that works well, then it's somewhat foolish to me to not take that opportunity, right? Like, I don't want to be the person who's like, well, you love Cad Bane and you love Darth Vader. Well, sorry, you can never play those two characters together, right? Like, why would I do that? If we can make a game that functions and it's all about telling stories with these characters, then you as the player should have the opportunity in your hobby and your personal collection to tell that story. And I think it opens up doors for people to really experiment with things. And then when people are like, but that's not what happened in the media, I'm like, yeah, because nobody wrote it yet. Like, let's be honest. The fact of the matter is that all it takes is one creative team in either a comic book or a movie or a TV show or a novel, and they just are like, and this happened. And all of a sudden it's canon, right? So you can't tell me that these things could never happen, because they absolutely can. It's just nobody's written it yet. So why can't you as the player be the one to write that? Now, sure, it's not approved canon by LFL, but why is that any different than the guy who gets hired, or the person who gets hired, the author, the director, the whatever, who gets hired, and they pitch an idea to LFL, and LFL's like, great, do it. And now all of a sudden, Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Dooku are working together to get away from, the clutches of Hondo Anaka, who's trying to bribe and sell them back to the different factions so he can make a quick set of units. Like, those things didn't happen before, but then all of a sudden they happen now. That's the long explanation as to why, to get back to team building, we put as few limiters on the process as possible to allow players to tell their story. Effectively in Shatterpoint, you're going to build a strike team. A strike team is composed of 2 squads. A squad is composed of 3 units. Units in Shatterpoint can be composed of 1 or more characters, which are miniatures. So if you look at the core box, for example, right, the Ahsoka squad includes Ahsoka Tano, Jedi No More, who's a primary unit. It includes Bo-Katan Kryze, who's a secondary unit, and it has Clan Kryze Mandalorians, which are supporting units. So those are your 3 units. The Ahsoka unit is 1 miniature. It's Ahsoka. Shocker. The Bo-Katan unit is one character. So 1 miniature. It's Bo-Katan. And then the Clan Kryze Mandalorians, you get 2 of them. So it's a unit that is composed of 2 characters. So you get 4 miniatures total. All of the core set squads basically work exactly the same. So they're squads of 4. There's flexibility, of course, in there because, at any point, a unit doesn't have to be 1 miniature or 2. There's no hard and fast rule. So, for example, the Inquisitor box, which we kind of briefly mentioned at Adepticon, that squad pack has 4 characters or has 4 units in it. Not 4 characters, that's 4 units, because two of the units in there are alternate supporting unit choices. So they're supporting units of 1, which means when you build that squad, you only get three miniatures instead of 4 like you do in the core box. But effectively, go ahead.
I was going to say, some of them we saw that were previewed look like there were 5, so there's going to be potential for having, a secondary unit that consists of 2 characters.
Yeah, some of them have options. So just like the Inquisitor box has an option for which supporting unit you would choose to go along with the other 2 in the pack. Some of them are 5 because they have, supporting units that are 2 miniatures, but they also have an alternate unit. There's, in the end, right, the squad building is locked into you have to have a primary, a secondary, and a supporting. How many miniatures those are composed of depends on the units that you select. The average, though, is always going to be 4. You're going to have like 4 miniatures per squad. So you're playing with 8 miniatures total. Now, when you build a squad, you have to choose your primary first, and that's important because the primary character tells you 2 important things. How many points you get to spend on the rest of the squad. So like Ahsoka Tano, Jedi No More is 8 squad points. Jedi General Anakin Skywalker, make sure I get the titles right because there are so many Anakins in the world, gives you 7 squad points. So this kind of balances the primary units, right? The more a primary unit can do, the better it is, the less squad points it gives. The less the primary unit can do, the more squad points it gives. So you can kind of balance it out in your builds, and it provides players choices and options to be able to like outfit the squads, and gives us as designers and developers a way to kind of put internal balance into these things. And then the other important bit, and this kind of goes back to the flexibility of squad and strike team building, is that the primary character gives you your era. So everything in the core box and most of the things that are coming out initially for the game are all Clone Wars era units, which means that effectively when you choose that primary unit, like Ahsoka, it says she's from the Clone Wars era. Everything that you choose for your squad also has to share that tag, which means that you can't take Ahsoka Tano Jedi No More and stick her with like Bar 2D2, the R2D2 from the Luke Skywalker pack, Lando, and let's say, somewhere in the distant far off future, maybe there's a Captain Phasma that appears. You can't take all these different things from all these different eras and stick them into the same squad. That's important for a development reason, because what I'll say next, you'll be like, well, why can't you put them in the squad? And we'll come back to why. Once you've built your squad, you build another squad. Now, the only rule in your strike team really is that you can't have the same named character or unit in both of your squads, right? You're limited to one Ahsoka Tano. So Ahsoka Tano, Jedi No More, and Padawan Ahsoka Tano, you got to pick one. You can't have both in your strike team. That also applies to like the nameless units. So for example, the 501st Clone Troopers, you can't include another 501st Clone Troopers. Now, in the far off future someday, maybe there's 501st Assault Clone Troopers. You could have 501st Clone Troopers and 501st Assault Clone Troopers because they have different names. But in the end, you're limited to one of each. Because even the nameless folks, we assume, have names, and you're going to name them, and then they're going to die, and you're going to be like, no, we loved that guy for all 15 minutes of his intro, and it's very sad that he passed away. I guess we'll get more next week, right?
How does that work with characters that we know share the same identity? Like, spoiler alert, Anakin Skywalker is Darth Vader. Are you allowed to have an Anakin Skywalker in one squad and a Darth Vader in another?
So all of the characters have a unique name. So if you're like an Ahsoka Tano, right, on the back of your card it says there's basically a unique name that says Ahsoka Tano. So that's where you compare it, right? Because Ahsoka Tano Jedi No More is not the same name as Padawan Ahsoka Tano, but then they have this extra little piece that says Ahsoka Tano, and that tells you can't take them together. So Darth Vader basically has a rule that means that you can't also have Anakin Skywalker with them, because we know as the audience that they're the same body, if not the same person. And I don't think we have time to get into that philosophical debate. Because I've seen it go both ways where people have been like, but he's not the same. I'm like, okay, but he's the same flesh bag. So, you know,
from a certain point of view.
Yeah, from a scientific point of view, his cells are the same, whether he's the same person internally by soul value.
The same midichlorians.
Thanks, Dan.
So, now, the one thing about that, though, is that your strike team can mix eras. So you can take, for example, let's say a Clone Wars squad with Obi-Wan Kenobi and Clone Commander Cody in the 212th, and you can put it together with, say, your Jedi Knight Luke squad that we previewed, right? And even though they're two different eras, that's totally fine. And the reason that is okay, whereas mixing things within the same squad from different eras is not necessarily because we're trying to like pretend to be canonical, right? I've already said we want you to live your best Star Wars experience, and if that is being as crazy as possible with taking your favorite characters and throwing them into a squad and then creating a justification about it, whether that justification is I'm telling this crazy story where they got caught between worlds, you know, the place between worlds, and time doesn't matter, and so they're just teaming up to try to get back to their spot, or I'm just doing it because I like these characters. Stop asking. Both of those reasons are completely justifiable, right? Like, it's fine. But the reason that we don't allow you to mix within squads is because it's really important that for us, development space, design space is not infinite. It's really big. Like, we can do a lot of things for a lot of time, but eventually you kind of hit the walls of it, right? By having squads built within their own eras, it means that you can have two different units that do similar things from different eras that still have value. So now all of a sudden it's not a question of, well, this one's just purely better. 501st Clone Troopers are purely better than Rebel Troopers, right? So I will always take the 501st Troopers out of the option. What the analysis now becomes is that if I want to take Jedi Knight Luke, the 501st are no longer my option. I can't use them to fill out my squad. I have to take the Rebel Troopers. So it gives breathing room for the fact that, you know, it's not a perfectly balanced game. Otherwise it would be really boring because it would just be one piece and it would all do the same thing. And nobody wants that. We want character, we want difference, we want interesting interactions. So that means that, you know, we go back to the curve, right? Every game, and every miniatures game, especially if it's good, has a curve. So you have your low powered stuff, your high powered stuff, and that curve can be as wide as you want. But really good games, in our opinion, have a very tight curve. But that curve still has to exist. There's always something on the top end and there's always something on the bottom end. You want the ends to be really close, but you never want them to touch. And so by effectively putting in the squad and error requirements to the squad, you now have that flexibility where you say, hey, maybe this thing isn't by the numbers the most efficient option, but what it gives you is the ability to use other things that you may want to use, whether that's, you know, a certain specific character from that era, or it's the synergies within that era and all that stuff. So that's, you know, 40 minutes on squad building philosophy. Probably didn't expect, but there you go.
Well, with the ability to mix and match so many different characters, is there actually any incentive or benefit for running themed or canonical squads?
Yeah, so obviously we want you to live your dreams, but we also want to provide kind of soft benefits or incentives to play a bit more to the story, right? And part of that is because one of the things that I think makes miniatures games so interesting and draw people like us in, you know, everyone on this call for so long, like I've been doing it for 32 years. I've played different miniatures games along the way, but I've always been just enamored with miniatures games. Part of that's the hobby, but the other part of it is just the mental exercise of playing the game, right? So in Shatterpoint, this kind of gets expressed through the eras, right? So now I'm making choices like which characters do I want? I have to then make choices based on the primary unit that I chose and who fits point-wise and era-wise. But also the biggest secret sauce of, I think, Shatterpoint and the part of list building that will become the most fun for players is that every unit has tags. So for example, like the 501st Clone Troopers have Clone Trooper, they have Galactic Republic. I think they have one other tag that I can't remember right now. But those tags become super important because most abilities that characters have, and the vast majority of them, almost like 90% of them, that influence other characters, like other allied characters, to do things outside of their activation. So the really juicy ones, the ones you want to use, always have a tag requirement, one or two. So for example, the one we gave out in the article was like Clone Captain Rex has Get a Move on Soldier. So at the start of his activation, when his card gets drawn, either he can choose himself or an allied Galactic Republic character, and they get to dash and gain a hunker token. So if you take, Asajj Ventress, Clone Captain Rex, and some bounty hunters, for example, in your squad, there's no Galactic Republic characters in that squad. And if you don't put Galactic Republic characters in your other squad, that ability like shrinks down, right? Now it only affects Clone Captain Rex. It doesn't give you benefits for your other characters. But let's say you decide that you're going to take, you're going to do the Galactic Republic squad of your dreams, and you take, just at the start of the game, the very launch of it, you take the Anakin Skywalker squad as built in the core set, which is Anakin, Rex, and the 501st, and you pick up the Obi-Wan Kenobi, Clone Commander Cody, and 212 pack, and you put those two together, you're going to be tagging off of each other all over the place, because everybody has Galactic Republic, all the clone troopers have Clone Trooper as a tag, and all of those characters have things that affect those different tags, right? So now all of a sudden, your opportunity to use your abilities becomes much more frequent, much easier to plan for. And that may be very beneficial to you as a player. That might be the thing that puts you over the edge, whether you want to play in a more competitive environment where you're trying to test your skills and your acumen at being able to squad build and play the game and use your synergies effectively, or you just happen to love clones and the Galactic Republic and you're like, I'm going to play this canonical squad. So now all of a sudden you're gaining these soft benefits for it, right? You're able to key off of things more. That doesn't necessarily mean that, this becomes the only way to play, right? But it is the advantage to limiting your choices more. There are characters in the game, and I think we've talked about Lord Maul being one of them. He doesn't care who he's with. That man is out for himself. So, when you're like, I'm going to play Maul, who cares what you take with him? Because he don't. Like, he doesn't help anybody. There may be characters down the line, obviously, that may interact with his Dathomirian tag or one of his other tags, right? And they might give him benefits. But there's always going to be opportunity to look at characters from okay, do I want to maximize my tags? Do I pick characters who don't care about tags because they just do what they do and I like that? Do I come up with a mix, right? Do I take some Clone Trooper Galactic Republic things that I know will tag off of each other and I adjust accordingly, and then I take some Separatist Alliance things, right? Out of the core set itself, I'm going to choose to take Anakin Skywalker and pair with the Asajj Ventress. So I have battle droids for Kalani, I have clone troopers for Rex, I have Galactic Republic stuff, I have Separatist Alliance stuff. I'm not going to get like supreme value, but if I play well and I understand what I'm trying to do, I might get just as much value as somebody who like goes across the board and picks one tag to rule them all. And so all those things, right? Like all of those choices make the game intriguing. It's what makes you stay up at night and think about things and open your card binder and be like, what if I did this? Or man, I wish when I played this game, I had that person, because think about how that tag could have worked. And that really is where like squad building becomes very flexible, but also forces choices that are meaningful. And that's really what you want, right? You don't want one path to be the clear victor. You want players to be able to find their style, their way, their choices, whether that's just based purely on flavor and fluff, whether that's based on a mixture of that and, strategies and tactics and synergies, or if the players are simply going, okay, I want my list to do this one thing and I'm going to make it do it super well, and that's going to win me the game every time. Go for it.
So with squad building, I mean, it's definitely something that sets it apart from both Legion and MCP. One of the other things that I thought was the most unique was the struggle system. Whether it's the cinematic aspect of having the three separate struggles that kind of shift the way the game is played, or the momentum tracker itself. Those are very, very different from anything we've seen before. Explain the system a little bit for people who may be a little confused because of how new it is. Sure.
So Shatterpoint's an objective-based game, and what that really means is that the way you win isn't by tabling your opponent. eliminating characters is important or wounding characters is important, but it's not going to be how you ultimately win the game. Instead, what you have to do is you have to go out and you have to complete the mission objectives better than your opponent. So the way that missions work in Shatterpoint is that we have what are called struggles. So ultimate victory in Shatterpoint comes when you win 2 out of 3 struggles. So it's kind of a best 2 out of 3. Each struggle has its own set of active objectives, which means that every time a player wins a struggle, you're going to flip over the next card in the struggle deck, and it's going to tell you, hey, turn off the active objectives, turn on these objectives. The battlefield has now changed and shifted. The scoreboard gets reset, but nothing else. So damage on characters, wounds on characters, how much force you have, where you are in your activation stack or your order stack, all those things stay the same. And it represents kind of that chaotic shift in, classic animated storytelling or like high adventure storytelling, where the characters think they have it figured out or they've just grasped some victory, and then, oops, new surprise. The bad guys had reinforcements. There was a traitor in your midst. Like, the person that was supposed to fly your shuttle got paid off by Lord Maul to fly away on you, and you can't get out now. So what are you going to do? Right? You have to adapt to a new and changing situation. So that's how the struggle trackers work. And basically the way that this is expressed in the game is that there are mission packs. So when a player builds their army, effectively their strike team, they also have to choose a mission pack. When the game launches, there's only one mission pack. It comes in the core set. It's called Shifting Priorities. As the game continues to grow and develop, there are more mission packs planned. So that choice of mission pack will the choice of mission pack will also have something to do with what you're trying to build your strike team to do, because each mission pack has a setup card that tells you where the objectives go. So Shifting Priorities is like the simplest one. It's a 3x3 grid. There are 9 objectives on the map, and based on the struggle card, some of those turn on. And then every mission pack has a special rule associated with it. So the Shifting Priorities special rule is that during the second and third struggles, there's a priority token that moves randomly about the board at the start of every player's turn based on rolling the defense die. And if you can control that priority token objective on your turn, you score 2 points instead of 1. So it becomes this game of like, I'm going to try to chase the token because it's really valuable, but I'm also going to have to realize that if it's really far away, is it worth going after the token, or am I better off trying to secure the other 2 points or do something else that's more rewarding, right? Because you don't have control over it. So those things go together to make a mission pack. The way you win a struggle is through the struggle tracker. And effectively, you can think of like the game as a game of tug of war. So each player at the start is trying to score 8 victory points. So every time at the end of your turn, if you control an objective, you score a point for the objective. So you're scoring at the end of every one of your turns, which is really important. There's no rounds in Shatterpoint, which I think is one of the nuances that makes it feel very different from everything else, but lends to that kind of like that frenetic kind of action that you want out of the game, because there's no stop point. Like the game just goes until it's over, and you never break. You never like reset, look at the table and be like, oh, I have a moment to breathe. It's just like, nope, keep playing. Don't stop. And so at the end of every turn, you score points. Well, when you score points, you basically take the struggle cube and you move it along your side of the track. So basically you can imagine they're going left and right, like you're pulling tug of war. If you can ever get the struggle tracker to the end of your track, you win the struggle. But of course, every time your opponent scores, they're going to pull that tracker towards their side. And so now you have this kind of like back and forth action that narratively shows the ebb and flow of like the momentum of the battle and who's getting closer to the objectives. And and you have this visual thing where you're seeing like your opponent's getting closer and closer, and you're becoming more and more desperate to pull it to your side. On top of that, the game needs a clock. You need a way to like break stalemates effectively, because there's a world in which we as players just never overcome each other. And so we're just playing this game until we die. That's not fun either. So the way that the clock works, the countdown timer in Shatterpoint works, is that there are momentum tokens. Momentum tokens shorten your track. So for every momentum you have to score 1 less VP to get that struggle tracker off your side of the board. So you can kind of think of it like you're shortening your rope to victory. The primary ways that players can score momentum tokens are by wounding enemy units. So again, dealing damage, like hurting people, is important because it'll give you a momentum token, which shortens your track. Every time the tracker, the little clear cube on the struggle tracker, hits 0. So let's say that John scores 2, and then on my turn I score 2. And so he's at 2, and then I pull it back to 0. So the cube lands on 0. We both gain a momentum. So the clock is ticking. Like you can't screw around forever because now each player's track is shorter. And then
when it only lands on 0 or if it crosses 0?
When it lands on 0. So if a player scores and that cube ends in the 0 spot, both players gain momentum. Now, if you as the active player score points, but you can't get it to your side of the board. So for example, John now has 4 points and I only score 2. So he's on his 4 spot on his side of the track and I move it to his 2 spot. I'm going to gain a momentum because my side's getting desperate. We realize that, we need to pick it up. We have to work harder because he's closer to victory than we are. So there's a little bit of a snapback mechanic where you as the player who's controlling the struggle cube on your side of the track are very close to victory. But every time your opponent kind of stops you from winning by pulling it back just a little bit, they're shortening their track. So it's not an impossible task to get it back over. And those are the primary ways that you gain momentum. So once a player pulls the struggle cube over to their end of the track and they win the struggle, they take the card. If it's the first one that they've won, you flip over the next card in the deck. If it's the second one they've won the game. So a game can end at the end of struggle 2 if the player who won the first struggle wins the second struggle. Or it can go all the way to kind of sudden death, which is phase 3, which is the third struggle. And then somebody's going to win because each player will have won struggle. So it also offers really, one of the things I really like about that system is that it offers these really interesting moments of reflection where you're like, can I win this struggle? Especially in the first struggle, right? You'll go back and forth. And then eventually you get to the point where you're like, okay, John just keeps beating my face in and I can't get that stupid token over to my side. So do I just give up on this struggle? And do I position myself knowing that those objectives are going to shift in a way that benefits me to the next time? Maybe that means that I wound a character instead of going for an objective. Like I focus on damage because wounded characters can't contest. And I kind of know where because there's 3 struggle cards in each phase. If you study the struggle cards a lot, you kind of know where they might end up. Now you randomly draw one of the 3, so you never know exactly where they're going to go up. The most amount of studying in the world won't tell you exactly which cards are in that deck. But you can kind of start to be like, okay, well, I think I'm pretty good if this one comes up, or maybe I'll move this guy over to here so that when I lose the struggle, I'll be in a better position to score 4 right away and put pressure on my opponent immediately at the start of that struggle. Because when, again, you score at the end of every turn, there's no cleanup phase. So when the player wins a struggle, their opponent is the first person who gets to score. And if you put yourself in a great position on shifting priorities to score 4 right out of the gate, your opponent's got a lot of work to do to come back. So you can make these estimations. Now, losing the first struggle is risky, right? Because if your gambit doesn't pay off and they win the second struggle, you've lost the game. So there's this really curious kind of like emerging strategies. And I'm excited to see how players adapt and react to this as they start to get reps under their belt with the game of like, okay, do I go balls to the wall and continue to try to take this struggle? Or do I step back, try to position myself for the second struggle? How important is winning that first struggle? And then, of course, that question changes with each different mission pack because the objectives are different, the special rules are different. And so that adds another layer of nuance to the game that will allow, the game to continue to thrive and be interesting as things go, and players will find different combinations of things work better with other things and all that stuff. And that's the exciting potential of games like this, is that they get to grow and evolve and change over time. And we get to kind of like seed that stuff and then watch as it matures. And then, the hard part of being a developer or a designer for a game like this is that sometimes you got to go in and you got to weed and you got to prune, and players get mad at you when you do that because obviously, changing, like snipping away branches that they love. It's like, I know you really like this part, but it's overcrowding this bush over here, or, this weed's got to go because it looks pretty, but it's not part of the garden. Like, I'm sorry, because games like this, and I think this is the biggest challenge and the thing that makes them the most fun to work on, from my opinion, compared to like board and card games, which I've worked on before too. Traditional board and card games they're just static environments. They're little terrariums. You kind of just build them and then you're done. And you're like, great, that was fun. On to the next thing. And they don't really change, right? They are what they are. Miniatures games, lifestyle games in general, but miniatures games specifically, they grow and they change and they do wild things. And so, if you love the chaotic nature of life, you really get to do that. I always tell people, I'm like, well, enjoy the last few minutes before we announce a game, because once it's announced or once it's released, especially, it's no longer yours. You have no control over it. You can guide it. You can, you can come in and try to shepherd it and culture it and nurture it. And we continue to do things, but it's the communities. Like, it's just on its own, right? It's Jurassic Park. You can't, life finds a way. It's just going to do what it does. And that's really exciting. It takes a lot of thought and takes a lot of work up front. And we spend as much time as we can trying to figure out where we think, the seeds will grow, and plan for the future. But you just never know. 'Cause even if you work on a game for 3+ years and you put in all the testing you possibly can to it, the second that game releases in about a month, there are more games played than you could have played in another 4 years. And so it's always exciting. It's always interesting. And a lot of the times the best things in games are the things you never intended. And so that's fun too. It's interesting to watch and to see. And if you've done your due diligence and you've done a really good job, the game and the ecosystem that you create will support those things, and it will benefit from it. Because that's the exciting part. I think that's what makes players love these games, is when you get to innovate on stuff yourself, right? It goes back to the cooking thing. We kind of give you the recipe book and we're like, here's all the stuff, go nuts. And then you create your own flavors out of it. And it's like, I did this and I did that. And watching the community kind of play off of each other, some list becomes dominant. Some great thinker, Galaxy brains a meta breaker, and then that list becomes dominant. And, the last thing that you want to do as a designer or developer is come crashing in like the Kool-Aid man every time somebody's like, this thing's too good. It's like, okay, well, can you figure it out? Right. I don't take away that joy from players. That's not your job, right? Your job is to fix things when the data really proves that they need fixing. And sometimes that's big and sometimes it's small. Most of the times it's little tweaks, but don't rob players of the community of the chance to be inventive and to, be part of the organic life of the game, right? No matter how much they may dislike it. And there will always be players that don't want to deal with that, and there'll be players who love it. And that's the other part of, the community itself, right? So I don't remember what you asked, but I'll just keep talking.
No, that's fantastic. One of the things we definitely have to talk about, though, is unit activation. You've got these awesome cards with some beautiful art on there. But one of those cards that can come up is the Shatterpoint. I mean, the entire game's named around it. What is the Shatterpoint? How does it interact with the game?
So for those who might not be aware or are a little behind the curve and are listening to this and they're like, what is Shatterpoint? One of the things about Shatterpoint that also sets it apart is the fact that, unlike many games of its ilk or other skirmish games, you do not have control over what activates when. So you don't have the ability to say, Anakin's going to activate now. Instead, what happens is every unit has an order card, which is the big, beautiful tarot trading card with their fancy artwork that Preston did with his amazing artists. And you shuffle all those cards up. And in addition to the unit cards from your strike team, which means that you have 6 cards, right? Because 3 units per squad. So 6 units over the course of a strike team. You also add a 7th card, which is the wild card, which is now known as the Shatterpoint card. And the Shatterpoint card is that moment of heroic inspiration. It's the place where you as the player get to make a choice. So with the Shatterpoint card, you can activate any of your units. A unit that's already gone previously because its card's in the discard pile. A unit that has yet to go because its card hasn't been drawn. Like, you can pick anybody you want, and it's one of the pieces that allow players more control over chaos, right? And it becomes really critical and important that players utilize that power correctly, because you get it once and then you won't see the Shatterpoint again until you reshuffle your deck. So proper use of the Shatterpoint is really key. It's also very exciting from a flavor standpoint, because it's like the moment that, Anakin stands up and he does his heroic thing, or Asajj Ventress comes back and stuns the heroes of the story unexpectedly. It's that moment of heroic inspiration again. And it's, I think that, along with the reserve system, it softens the blow of complete randomization in terms of what activates when. It also gives the players, once again, the opportunity to be clever, right? picking the right unit with that Shatterpoint card at the right moment, or at the moment that you draw it, is a big deal. If there's going to be, and I think the thing that's really interesting about it, and one of the emergent strategies that you'll see, because we saw it internally, is that, when you start playing the game, you'll be like, always a primary unit. Why would I use it on anything but a primary unit? Because the primary units do the most. You want them to activate the most in the game. 100%. By the numbers, it's the right play. But once you become better at analyzing the table situation and understanding that, sometimes activating that unit of 501st clones so that they can just run over and grab the objective so you can score that last point that you need to win the struggle is way more important. So sometimes it's the no names that are the true heroes of the story, right? And knowing when to exercise that and how to utilize it to the best of the ability and be creative with it is really important. So the Shatterpoint card is the wild card, and of course it ties into the whole. This is the magic of the fact that the game was never named Shatterpoint originally, but our name got denied, and so then we went back to the drawing board, and we wound up with Shatterpoint as the name. And like once we picked Shatterpoint, we were like, holy crap balls! Like it fit so much what we're trying to do. Why didn't we figure this out before? And I blame Josh Cologne because he yells a lot at me, and I can't process it all the time. So sometimes
I'm sure he wasn't just scanning his bookshelf and he saw, oh yeah, that novel from 2003.
So 100%. The full story of Shatterpoint is, so Josh, our art director for the Marvel game, he is the biggest Mace Windu fan in the world. He loves that character in unhealthy ways. So much so that when we go and visit our friends at LFL, he will be like, if you see anything Mace Windu, I will spare no expense, bring it back to me. And he does that because there's very little Mace Windu merchandise in the world. Like they just don't do a lot of things with that character, which is unfortunate, but it makes him all the more voracious for stuff. So anyway, when we were working on Mace Windu in playtesting and stuff, of course he was like, he has to have an ability called Shatterpoint because of the novel. And then he basically told me the entirety of the novel, and I was like, great, Josh, I didn't need all that info, but I understand now. We'll give him the thing.
You're gonna get it all, though.
Yeah, you get everything with Josh. He does not hold back. He knows it all. And then as we were trying to come up with names for it, he was like, you should name it. You should name it Shatterpoint. And I was like, I'm not naming the game after the ability that you made me give Mace Windu. It's not happening. Plus, we weren't really sure if they'd be cool with it because of the book title and all that stuff. So anyway, so we had what we thought was the perfect name. We got right to the end where we were about ready to get it all finalized. And the legal folks came in and they were like, you can't use this because of a reason. And so we were all just devastated because naming a game is one of the hardest things to do. So
can you tell us what it was?
I don't, honestly, I've expunged it from my mind. Like they always say that, one of the weird tricks that nature plays on women when they give birth is that they forget how terrible the birthing process was because nature needs you to do it again. I feel like it's the same here. Like I just forgot because I was so upset and devastated when that news came through that I just expunged it from my memory. I do, however, remember the code name of the game because I still use that internally, and that was Fulcrum. So we always give projects a code name because we have to be pretty secret about these things. And so for all the years that we were working on the game, it was named Fulcrum. And it's bittersweet when you have to realize that your code name can no longer be the name because you've grown so accustomed to it. You're like, oh no, you're about to enter adulthood, game. So you need your true name. What is your true name? You're no longer Little Feather. You're something else. So anyway, so I was like, no, Josh, we're not going to name it that. But then we went back to the drawing board and we were having the discussion, and with some pain in my heart as we were talking about names and couldn't find anything, I was like, what about Shatterpoint? I was like, it does make sense in all these levels. It would work this way. It's a cool name. Like it just sounds cool, Shatterpoint. It's got that animated like name drive to it where you're like, yeah, you can see 8-year-olds just yelling Shatterpoint as they bash their like or their like action figures.
Yes, 8-year-olds.
Yeah.
People our age, come on.
So I know you're on a time crunch, so we don't want to waste too much of your time. Let me get one question I got to ask out of the way. I'm a huge Arena Rex fan. One of my most favorite casual games, and Arena Rex has a similar damage tree mechanic to what you guys have. So when you guys were dropping the preview articles, and I saw that the character cards would have these damage tree mechanics, I was excited. I was like, I love that aspect of the game. What went into the creation of that for Shatterpoint, and why did you go with that as opposed to just like your standard damage system like in Legion?
Yeah, so obviously, like I kind of talked about before, one of the things that happens, or at least the way in which my brain works, and I think kind of AMG's dev brains work in general, is we voraciously, play lots of stuff. And I'm very familiar with that game that you mentioned. I loved a lot about it, and it just kind of stuck with me. I was like, this is so cool. It did things in very interesting ways, and I thought one of the things for me that I've never been particularly happy about with miniatures games in general is the level of abstraction when it comes to combat. Right? It's important because you obviously can't replicate real-time actions with miniatures. It just doesn't quite work. But that question of like, okay, well, how do you get players who are playing with these static miniatures on a tabletop to feel like, or to see, right? To be able to visualize as they play the game, the actions that we know are happening. One of the things that always kind of I feel like is a detriment to miniatures games is they're beautiful and they're visually stunning, and they're jaw dropping when players are playing on 3D terrain with their painted miniatures and all this stuff. But we as people, we as human beings have this tendency to be like, well, what we see is what's happening, right? And that's where you get all these arguments about like, well, the guy's not just standing there static for you to shoot him. He's moving around. Like there's an abstraction in terms of like how the actions are performed in the game versus the actual story the game is telling, or the way in which the movie of it would play out, right? And so kind of cracking that code and saying to me, one of the most influential things or important things about Star Wars is the way in which it tells story through combat. The duels that characters engage in, the way in which they fight, the way in which they react to the pressures of combat tell you more about a character than most of their dialogue does in Star Wars, or where that character is in terms of their emotional journey or what's happening. And those are the things that people key in on. The classic one being Revenge of the Sith, Anakin versus Obi-Wan. The fight starts and you can tell that Obi-Wan is not trying to finish Anakin. He's trying to reason with him. Like he's using his mastery of Form 3 to slow him down, but he's not pressing the attack. He's not, he thinks that he can save his friend and it won't require him to effectively kill his brother. And then you hit that moment where Obi-Wan, says the classic line, well, then you truly are lost. When Anakin tells him that from his perspective, the Jedi are evil. And all of a sudden the tone of that fight changes. Like you watch the way Obi-Wan approaches combat and he flipped his stance card in Shatterpoint terms. Like he's not messing around anymore. And he ultimately like puts himself in a position where he can finish Anakin and win the fight. And you can trace that emotional journey, and you see it in all of the combats, right? Like even episode 4, the very first lightsaber duel we get between Obi-Wan and Vader, well, very subdued by its own nature, tells you a story, right? Like it's clear that Vader can just finish Obi-Wan whenever he wants, but he wants to savor the moment. There's stuff between these two, and you can read that as an audience member. You can see that. So putting that into Shatterpoint, when we talk about, capturing the feel and the drama of the game and the tone of the game that we wanted, was crazy important. And so the one thing that I knew right when we were talking about doing the game and diving into the development and the very first designs was, how do we make combat as dynamic and interactive as possible? How do we tell that story through miniatures on the table? And we went through some things that totally didn't work. The combat trees were always there, and that was because I just thought that the kernel of that idea from what we had seen before in some games was fantastic. And I loved I loved what it had the potential to be, and I wanted to take those like seeds, and I wanted to see how far we could push them. Because I felt like there was so much more you could do with it, and it seemed to really fit this game. But we did things like we had the very first combat system, had the combat trees, had the dice, but when you made an attack, if the defender wound up getting more successes than the attacker, the defender actually got to go down their tree to really showcase the fact that attacking people is dangerous. Because if you're not very good at attacking them, they will riposte and hit you back, or they'll shoot while you're exposed, that kind of stuff. And ultimately, it didn't work out. But from that concept, we drilled down, and what we wound up doing was making the expertise trees, which became part of that, to show like the characters' initiatives and their personal training and how they reacted to combat. We really built out the combat trees and the things that characters could do with them and all of that stuff. So it was just one of those things that, I wasn't going to accept a Shatterpoint that didn't have it, because to me that was the game, and it was so core to the experience that we wanted. That we put a lot of our effort and energy in that very start, like figuring out, okay, what does that mean? How does it work? And that focus then translated into a lot of things like lethality and how much damage characters can do and stuff. When does a character die? Do they not die? How does all that stuff works? And the fun part about that is every time that you change lethality, you have to change everything. Because if you're like, well, characters can die. Okay, we'll tune damage down a lot. Maybe characters can't die. We better tune damage up a lot. All these things. So it's like you got to rewrite everything based around some of these fundamental pillars. And eventually we ended where we did, which I think is a really good mix of, dealing damage. We always wanted damage to be important, but we didn't want it to be the crux. And when you're talking about character-focused games, the worst experience in the world is taking your favorite character that you just painted, putting them on the table, and watching them get removed before they get to do anything, right? It's awful. It's horrible. Alpha strikes do not have a place, in my opinion, in skirmish games. Like, you should always get a chance to respond in some way. So how do you apply that to Shatterpoint? We did different things than we did in Crisis Protocol, for instance, with the injury mechanic, but there's some similar threads between them. That's where wounding came from. Then we added the durability stat, because we said, you know what? Not having characters die at all is probably not that cool. You should be able to remove them, but it should be really hard. How does that work? So we added the injury tokens. And then once we had the wounds and the injuries figured out, we came down to the fact that, hey, dealing wounds is good. Dealing injuries doesn't seem to really matter. So what if having wounds and injuries increased the force cost of your abilities, because you're getting worn out? It's taking you more effort to be influenced by the force and that kind of stuff. You're losing your spirit to fight. And at that point, we kind of cracked what the game needed from a combat perspective. But it all tied back to the fact that I was very insistent that combat trees were going to be there. And it started with every character being able to flip their combat stances. We cut that down to just the primary units because the cognitive load was a bit high for that. And it made sense that the main characters would be the ones that would have the choice, because Star Wars is all about choice. And ultimately, when you pick your primary unit, what you're saying from a story perspective is that this episode we're about to play is about these characters. And the folks that come along with them are there for, like, they're supporting and secondary characters, just like the name implies.
So with terrain interactions, with MCP, everything's kind of done on a 2D scale from the top down. Mm-hmm. And Legion has their own unique way of doing cover and elevation and stuff like that. But, it wouldn't be a Star Wars game if taking the high ground didn't at least have some kind of impact. So we're seeing a lot of stuff with in the rule book with elevation, overlapping, stuff like that. But one thing I wanted to ask about was line of sight. So sure. There's a short paragraph in the rule book that touches on line of sight, but I know there's a lot of questions that were being raised to go into detail on that a little bit more. Could you explain a little bit on that?
So, ultimately, I'm the designer, not the developer. So if you want the crunchy rules answer, go to the forums when they open, and that'll be close to the game's release, and you can ask, and there'll be a dedicated group of like rules lawyerese folk who will give you exactly what you need. But the general answer, right, is that the Shatterpoint terrain rules and line of sight rules are written to allow for the most the most crazy and innovative terrain setups as possible that use a lot of elevation. And they're written in a way that 99% of the time, what you think as a player should happen will be supported by the rules. So, for example, much like, and some of them are based off of principles from our previous games, especially Crisis Protocol. So, if you play that game, the best way to think about it is every character is size 2. When you stand on terrain, you're size 3. Which means that if you're elevated, everyone can see you. And the person who's elevated might not be able to see you if their line draws through something that would obstruct you. But for the most part, right, it should be very easy and quick to determine in terms of like, there's only the amount of elevation bands don't really matter, because you're just simply saying, am I elevated to what I'm looking at or not? And then if you're elevated, you're exposed. People will very easily be able to see you. You don't have to do trig. We don't like trigonometry in our game, so there's no, there's none of that. You don't measure on an angle. It's all flat across, which means that there are abstractions in there. For example, you can be at the very back edge of a building, and the person who's like at the very bottom edge of the building can see you, even though, yes, they would be looking through the building. But again, these characters are not static. They're not standing there. And the game isn't about that, right? It's not about perfect tactical positioning. It's about action and excitement. So, for the most part, right, the goal with the rules was, and line of sight and terrain rules, to be honest, are the worst. They are the worst things to write, because you are taking something that we all innately understand but can't explain in our normal lives, and you're abstracting it down to a tabletop game that uses 3-dimensionality but can't use 3-dimensionality in a perfect way, right? And no game, I think, has ever done line of sight in a way that everyone has been like, this is beautiful, this is the gold standard, slow. There's always problems with it, right? There's always questions. There's always people who are like, well, it shouldn't work that way, it should work this way. And the system that we've put in place, I'm sure will have questions, or folks will be like, well, what does this do? What does that do? For the most part, I think the big thing with any terrain system and line of sight system is that reading the rules alone is not sufficient to understanding how the system works, right? You have to play games with it. You have to put it into application. And once you get used to the kind of the weirdness of the abstractions that they do, for example, having a character be physically not able to see through true line of sight because they would draw line of sight through the building itself, but instead, playing the game and being like, okay, well, I can see you. We may be like, but he can't see through the building, but he can, because the rules say that you ignore the piece of terrain that the person's standing on. It will become second nature, and players will quickly pick it up. The big challenges with some of the rules, and one of the things that was interesting about it was, the Crisis Protocol rules have far more abstraction when it comes to how certain things work, because you have to create systems around which you want the games to focus. So in Crisis Protocol, throwing terrain is super important, right? It's core. It's a fundamental pillar of the game experience and the superhero battle experience. Terrain has to be destructible. Well, once you say terrain is destructible, it opens a whole can of worms if you allow terrain to do complex things. Like, for example, if you allow a gantry to exist, an underpass, what happens when the gantry gets removed and another character lands on top of another character, right? The simplicity of just put it where it's standing, but on the ground level, doesn't work. What happens when you have very simple size restrictions? So every piece of terrain has a size to it. Okay, that works until you say, we're going to make, a ziggurat, and the elevation bands will matter. Well, okay, what happens when you destroy part of, you look at the Shatterpoint terrain setup, right? If each of those elements, the building, the gantry, and the other building it's attached to, are individual pieces with their own individual sizes, what happens when you destroy the building that the gantry is connected to, but the gantry can't stand anymore because its support is gone? So is it all one terrain piece? And if it's all one terrain piece, by Crisis Protocol rules, it's all one block. So you can't have it be different. But with Shatterpoint, we wanted those variances in elevation. We wanted to see characters jump from one level to the next, to have those kind of iconic Star Wars moments where characters are on different crisscrossing elevations and all of that stuff. So the abstraction comes in different ways, and what you can do becomes different. And then how you manage that becomes important. And so each of the games, again, does things with abstractions that are unique, and they don't always make sense because it is a game and it's not reality. And, you can't simulate reality on a tabletop anyway. But the golden rule really is that if you and your opponent think a terrain piece should do X, Y, or Z, it probably does X, Y, or Z. My classic example is in the demo is like, look at this gantry. We know we can see through it. You can see through it by the rules. We know you can walk through it. You can walk through it by the rules. What that means abstraction-wise is that, yes, a character can see directly through the gantry. You'll notice that all of the Shatterpoint gantries have little holes in them. That's because we knew this was going to be a thing. So if you're using the official terrain, then you'll be like, well, of course I can see you because they're physical, like there's pass-through in this gantry. If you're playing on one of your cool gantries that you made at your house and it doesn't have pass-through, doesn't really matter. The rules say you can see right through that piece of steel. It's got to be that way. By the same token, if you say, hey, this is something you can move through because you want people to be able to go under the underpass of the gantry, you can go straight through the gantry, right? But, if you just take a moment and kind of abstract and think about it from a storytelling perspective, Anakin Skywalker does a weird cartwheel flip and pops underneath it. The clone troopers like lock on their little grappling hooks and they rappel down and they wind up underneath it, right? There's very easy storytelling elements where you can be like, okay, I guess like this makes enough sense that we can go with it. And if you don't want to do that, then at the end of the day, it's like, well, tough noogies, that's how the rule has to work so that it can do everything else it has to do, right? We all make sacrifices. This is one of them. So, and that goes with like overhang as well, right? You wind up in these spots where you're dealing with three-dimensional objects and the base really matters. And what we don't want to do is play Jenga. So a lot of the rules get really touchy about what can you overhang and what's allowed and what's not, based on the fact of really the question is being asked, is there an instance where if this thing overhangs, it's going to overhang over another miniature? And what does that mean? Because we can't answer that question. Like if two bases occupy the same infinite volumetrics, like volume sphere, like cylinder of each other, the game breaks from what happens in this instance? What does that mean? So a lot of the abstraction comes from like stopping that, not allowing that to happen. It stops the whole, well, I'm going to put my guy here and then I'm going to spend 5 minutes out of the game trying to carefully balance my character on something because I know if I just do it just right, he'll balance. But if I don't,
I know that guy,
right? Yeah. And then, the worst of it is you get the people who are like, I'll just bring out the blue tack stick. And you're like, oh, jeez, please don't. Like just from a we're playing a game perspective, let's not do that. So, we're trying to eliminate that stuff too, right? In the end, if you place Anakin on top of some crates, or if you place your B1s in a way in which they kind of slightly overhang the terrain and you didn't see it, does it really matter? No, it doesn't. But those things that we can hand wave or just accept as margin of error in playing a game because they don't have catastrophic effects on the overall rules or the play of the game. You can't assume that in a rule book, right? Your mission statement is to make sure that the rules are clean, as concise as possible, and they don't allow for things that can't be answered within the rules themselves. And sometimes that means that you get weird things. And then, you throw back to the fact that everyone comes with preconceived notions based on how line of sight and terrain should work from other games, or just from their existence as a human being and how they've interacted with terrain and line of sight their entire lives. And it gets to the point where it's like, yeah, I can give you 6 pages of examples and you still might not be clear on it. Play some games with it. And honestly, if you get 90% of the way there, you're doing just fine, right? It's not going to be perfect all the time.
For the remainder of it, head to the rules forums and talk to the rules Mandalorian.
Yeah, if you have and I have no doubt that there will be, if you want the exact specific rules wording, then you go to the rules forum and they will either tell you that they'll answer your question or they'll just say, read the rules. What does the rule say? It's one of those like necessary evils that in order for us to have a good time and have a great experience, we need to both, like, everyone needs to work from the exact same understandings. There are, many times in your playing career where when you're playing something completely wrong for years, you don't know it, your opponent doesn't know it, and it doesn't matter, right? So I think the one thing that I always try to tell people is the myth of perfect play is an absolute myth. I have not once in my entire 32 years of miniatures gaming watched a single game between any people, no matter how hard they tried, that was perfect. Like, somebody made a mismeasurement. If you, like, somebody bumped the table, somebody put something down and like nudged it with their finger, somebody forgot a rule, they just forgot. Like, it's impossible. You're playing with physical components, with physical hands, and a flawed human brain. So in the end, right? Yes, you should always endeavor to never cheat. You should always endeavor to play as well as possible, but you should never expect that your games will be perfect. It's just never going to happen. It's, if you want that, you have to go play basically something that's dictated by a computer AI, where perfection can be maybe achieved, but even then you'll forget things. So are you playing the perfect game? I don't know.
Yeah, but I can't paint pretty pictures on computer AI, so I'm going to stick with mini games.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think there's just that there's a time and a place for everything, right? And if you're at a Worlds event at Adepticon, sure, check the rules for them, make sure that you're right to the letter of the law as best as you understand it. If you're just playing Friday night with people and having a good time, and my B1s don't quite fit on this gantry, but like they're so close, and your opponent says, I don't care, just put them there, they should be able to fit. Okay, great. Like, let's keep playing, right? Don't lose the fun for the rules, right? That's never.
I want that put like up in the sky, emblazoned for everybody to read always. But I couldn't agree with that sentiment more. Mr. Shick, Will, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us. I feel like we've had you long enough. Your teenager might be wondering where you're at again.
We got 9 days before that happens minimum. So
all right, let's keep going.
Yeah, I got 30 more minutes. If you want to ask the rest of the questions in your list, let's go.
Well, we do want to give you a chance. Is there anything else you'd like to bring up or address for people out there in the world?
Probably, but I feel like I've ranted and raved quite a bit on this podcast. So hopefully people are okay with my weird soapboxing. No, like, really,
it's been great. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah. I got one.
At least two of us. We're good. Yeah.
At least two. That's 2 out of 3. I've won by Shatterpoint rules.
Dan is hard to please. Yeah.
That's fair.
Very.
No, I mean, I super, like, hopefully, the one takeaway is just like, I absolutely love what we get to do at AMG. I know that we'll never be perfect. I think one of the things I've always been very clear about is we're gonna make mistakes. We're gonna screw up. We're gonna not see interactions or have things like spin out of control of where we wanted them to be, and we're gonna address that, and we're gonna fix it, and we're gonna learn from the next time. And I know that those instances can be frustrating or disappointing, but all much like every hobbyist ever, right? For us, there's no end game. There's just a journey of self-improvement. We want to be craftsmen, right? Not professionals. And a craftsman just continues to get better the more they do something. So that's, like, will there be some weirdness with certain things? Yeah, we'll address it. Will we always do what you want? Probably not. Sorry. I wish I could please everybody all the time, but it's not going to happen. So, at the end of the day, all we can really do is reestablish the fact that, everything that we do, we're doing with a purpose. We think about it a lot. We do our due diligence to make sure that we're making the best choices we can with the information that's available. And it's not going to please everybody all the time, but we're trying to make sure that all the games under our care, have long, robust lives, and ideally will be played long after we've passed over the stewardship of them to somebody else. But yeah, and hopefully, I'm excited to see everyone get Shatterpoint. I'm really, really interested after so many years of playing it internally and developing our own meta, what the world's meta is going to be. Like, what are people going to find that we missed? What are people going to gravitate towards? What is the game environment going to look like? It's a wondrous and exciting time, and a little nerve-wracking, but pretty exciting. I remember the day when we were playtesting and Michael Plummer, who was still new to the game, showed me that you could go down a ladder as well as up it. And I was like, holy shit, I've been playing this game for like almost a year now, and I didn't figure that out. So, like sometimes you get tunnel vision, right? And you're like, ladders go up. That's great. And he moved a character and was like, I'm within range 1 of the ladder. I'm going to go down it. And I was like, you genius.
Well, as excited as you are for everyone to get a hold of it, I think we're probably more excited to actually get our hands on it ourselves.
I have no doubt, because I've been playing a bizarre and weird proxy version of it forever. We now have real miniatures in our hands, and we're getting to paint them and stuff for streams and everything. And so it's been a joy. But yeah, I remember being on the other side of it and just being like, man, I can't wait. Give me the things. I just want the things. So hopefully everyone gets it and they enjoy it, and it gives them another experience in the Star Wars galaxy that, will tell the whole story. I think one of the things that I'm most excited about with Shatterpoint is, if you dissect the great moments in Star Wars, you have big starship battles, squadron style fights. They're happening around the starship battles where you see the pilots and they're doing their thing and they're dogfighting. And you've got the big ground battles, and then you've got the zoomed in focus on the characters doing the things while the big battles around it. And we kind of have that. We have that whole ecosystem now with all of the games that we've offered, and it's very exciting. It's very exciting to be at a point where, you can kind of see the holistic view of Star Wars coming together around these different miniatures games. And I hope that, now players can find something that they're excited about, no matter what attracts you to the galaxy. And we'll continue to do our best to make those things as fun as possible.
Awesome.
I'm just waiting for the moisture farming simulator.
You keep waiting for that, buddy.
To be honest, this is pod racing is probably before the moisture farming simulator, but who knows? I don't control everything.
Okay. Star Wars Shatterpoint coming to you on June 2nd. Pre-orders are available now on the Asmodee web store, or head on over to your FLGS, and if they're not planning to carry it, poke them until they do. So that's the best advice. Will, thank you so much again for coming on the show. It is always a great pleasure, and we hope to have you again on real soon.
Yeah, anytime, guys. I really appreciate you guys all taking the time, inviting me on, listening to me ramble. I love talking shop, and I will do it nonstop until somebody stops me. So there you go.
Thanks so much, Will. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this very first episode of Chatterpoint. Please make sure to leave us a review on whichever platform you may be listening on, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, YouTube, Libsyn, Zencaster, and I'm sure I forgot a few. But you can always contact us at outriders@gmail.com, or the Facebook page, facebook.com/Legion Outriders, which we're currently working on rebranding. So, right, Dan?
Yeah.
That? Okay.
Yeah. I've got a lot of work ahead of me on the social space.
Yeah, so we'll be including both shows, both Chatterpoint and the Legion Outriders. But in the meantime, where can people find you, gentlemen? Dan?
Well, on Discord as either Dan Tech or Outrider Dan. And I'll be managing the Facebook page just like I do with the Legion side. So, we're going to keep it all on one page, right?
Yeah, we'll just be splitting it between the two. It'll be fine. John, how about yourself?
I am on Discord officially, but very rarely ever on there, at Wookiee of the Year. And for Instagram, where you can find all my painting stuff, Outrider_John. So as soon as I get my hands on the play kit for Shatterpoint, I'm going to make sure I get those painted up for demo games and on the Instagram for everyone to see.
And I'm sure we'll be talking to you about your building and painting process. You can find me on Twitter at @grn_Archer or on Twitch at Captain_Archer. Thank you guys, and we'll see you next time for the second episode of Chatterpoint.